Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the Ukrainians are hanging in there against a fierce Russian invasion. What can you tell us about the status of where Russian forces are and how Ukrainian defenses have held up?
So it's been about a month since Russia launched this invasion, and it's actually been somewhat stunning in how poorly it's gone for them thus far. And so what we're hearing from the Pentagon is that they've taken over very few major cities, and their ultimate goal of capturing Kyiv and overthrowing the government not happening.
Right.
And not only has it not happened to date, but they've tried to encircle the city. That hasn't really worked out, and it's actually gotten to the point where Ukrainian forces have even started forcing Russian troops who have amassed around Kyiv further away. And so we've seen, according to the Pentagon, some Russian troops taking defensive positions where they're at so that they don't get pushed back even further. So they've sort of settled into where they're at, and we're talking on the outskirts of Kyiv, and they just are ready to stay there. And to some extent, they're waiting for additional supplies, which we've heard is a big issue that they've faced, whether it's a lack of fuel, a lack of food, and we've also heard recently this week that some Russian troops have been actually taken out of the battle with frostbite.
Right.
And so we're really seeing a confluence of factors going against the Russian military that really suggest a lack of planning. And so that's been fascinating to watch. We've seen for years the U.S. government talk about the vaunted Russian military, and yet from everything we've seen through the first 4 weeks of this war, they really haven't accomplished much of what they set out for. The Pentagon has said they really haven't done what they looked to do in the first couple days, in the first couple weeks. And so we're seeing Russia adopt new tactics, which is really sort of a submission tactic. They are bombing and bombarding various cities into ruin. They are now, according to the U.S. government, going after civilians. The U.S. government earlier this week announced that they've seen evidence to suggest Russian troops have been committing war crimes. Now, that isn't of itself necessarily, that's more of a allegation, not as much a charge. It would have to be tried in a court, whether that's the ICC or it could be charged in a Ukrainian court. But it still is very notable that the U.S. government would label the Russian military to be engaging in such tactics.
And a lot of this is portrayed as the Russians are frustrated by their lack of advances on the ground, so they've had to rely on more desperate measures, whether that's bombardment of cities, whether now the Biden administration has been worried that there might resort to chemical weapons, biological weapons. So that does lend more credence to the possibility war crimes are being committed in Ukraine.
Absolutely. So it's not only about what they're doing now, but what the next steps could be. And it's all about this desperation that you mentioned. And so it's fascinating because we've seen allegations that they've targeted a maternity hospital. We've seen allegations that they targeted a theater, both of which occurred in Mariupol, a city on the coast. And both of these allegations were decried at the time for targeting civilians. And one other interesting aspect is because this war has gone on for so long, they've used so much of their supplies, specifically missiles. They've launched over 1,200, according to the Pentagon, to date, that they're actually running out of their precision-guided missiles and are now being forced to use what are called dumb bombs, which are essentially less accurate ammunitions. And so that could be also a contributing factor to these instances where civilians are targeted. That being said, the U.S. says that they are either attacking civilians indiscriminately or actually deliberately. So while this lack of or use of resources and not having additional supplies available could also be a contributing factor in that.
How much of this is the valiant Ukrainian defense versus Russian incompetence?
That's a great question. And so it's important to remember that the Russian military, even with their incompetence, still outnumbers the Ukrainian forces. That being said, none of this would be possible if it weren't for the efforts that the Ukrainian military, and not just the military, but a lot of civilians, are putting up. And so the Pentagon has been very strong in their acknowledgement that none of what's happening now would be possible if it weren't for the Ukrainians putting up the battle that they are in their home country for freedom. And so between what they've been able to do thus far, and that's also through the help of the U.S. and a handful of NATO allies who provided them with military technology and weaponry, they really have been one of the main sources of frustration for the Russian military because the Russian military really hasn't accomplished much in 4 weeks. They were expecting to topple the government in days. And they're 10 to 15 miles outside of Kyiv, as they are many other cities. And so this really, for a month now, the Ukrainians have steadfastly defended their major population centers, particularly the capital, and they've been successful thus far. And we saw President Zelensky repeatedly urge NATO to provide even more resources, and the U.S. ask for even more resources from them as they are able to prolong their fight.
So the fact that all of this has happened has sort of changed the U.S. and NATO's calculus too, because I think many of the Western leaders also thought Russia would be able to topple the Ukrainian government quickly, and then the West would end up arming and supporting an insurgency against the Russians. But what's instead happened is that the Ukrainians have held fast, and so the aid and the resources they need is a little bit different. And President Biden has met with NATO leaders in Brussels. What are some of the things that they're doing and not doing in response to these Ukrainian cries for help?
So that's a great question. So a big part of what they're doing is, as we said, providing military technology. But the overarching piece of technology that they want are fighter jets. And so far, the U.S. has been unwilling to do that. They even vetoed or declined to do a deal with Poland when Poland came out and suggested that they would give their entire fleet of aircrafts to Ukraine and have the U.S. backfill them. And the U.S., in addition to not really wanting to participate in the backfill order, didn't want the U.S. to get involved in this because the U.S., first and foremost, doesn't want to be pulled into this conflict.
Right.
And according to the Biden administration, providing fighter jets could be seen by the Russians as either an act of aggression, escalation, or an entrance into the war. And so the U.S. thus far has refused to participate in any sales of jets. Now, that doesn't mean they are actively trying to stop other countries from doing that. They just don't want to partake in that themselves. Instead, they provided millions of dollars of other technology, whether that's helmets, Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles, a number of other things that have all proven useful. Now, the overarching thing that President Zelensky has asked for repeatedly has been a no-fly zone.
Right.
And now the U.S. and NATO neither have said that they would support a no-fly zone because in both cases, agreeing to a no-fly zone would require shooting down something that encroaches on the no-fly zone, which in this case would likely be a Russian plane. And so doing anything that would result in the possibility of shooting down a Russian plane would be seen as an extreme act of aggression from the other side. And so both the U.S. and NATO, the most important thing to them is preventing the war from growing further.
Right.
And so while they can't control what Russia does, and Russia could bring NATO into the war, their big goal is to prevent themselves from getting dragged into it, which is why they haven't agreed to a no-fly zone.
But they have fortified NATO's eastern flank.
Yes. The U.S. Has deployed troops to the eastern flank, as well as NATO, who has deployed multiple battalions now to various countries along the eastern flank of NATO, all in an effort to ensure that this doesn't get further out of hand or expand to include other NATO countries.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at WashingtonExaminer.com.